Welcome to our deep dive, everybody. Today we're tackling the German export engine. And I'm really excited to get into this. You've given me this Harvard Business School case study, the German export engine. So let's break it down.
Yeah, it's a great case study. It really gets to the core of, what makes Germany such a global economic powerhouse. And, we're going to be looking at everything from their financial systems to how they approach, labor relations and a lot more.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. I think what I'm really interested in is how they've managed to maintain this strength in exports through so many different periods of global and economic upheaval. Like there's just been so much change. What's something that really stands out to you as we kind of get started here?
I think one of the most interesting things is how Germany industrialized, differently than a lot of other European powers. If you look at England or France, they were unified nations long before they became economic giants. But Germany was really the opposite.
So they were kind of an economic force before they were even a country.
Yeah, in a way. And, that had a really profound impact on how their economic model developed. And a really key figure to understand here is this guy, Friedrich List. He was a 19th century economist, and he really challenged the whole, idea of just free trade.
Oh, so he was against open markets.
Well, not exactly. He believed in open markets, but he had a very nuanced view, right? He argued that, forcing developing economies to compete with, already established industrial powers was kind of like, kicking them while they're down. So he believed in this idea of strategic protectionism. He thought countries should protect their industries until they're strong enough to compete globally. He even used Britain as an example. He pointed out that Britain hadn't gotten rich through just pure free trade. They had strategically protected their own development.
Oh, so it's kind of a do as I do, not as I say sort of thing.
Exactly, yeah. And that resonated really deeply in Germany. They formed this thing called the Zollverein. It was a customs union. And basically what that did was it removed internal trade barriers between, all these different German states. And it allowed them to develop, as a unified industrial base before, really opening up to global competition.
Okay, that makes sense. So kind of building that strong foundation before you build a skyscraper on top of it.
Exactly, yeah.
And the Zollverein, that eventually kind of led to political unification as well, right?
It did, and Bismarck was really the key figure in that. He was very strategic. He unified Germany through, a series of wars, and that's how the modern German state was created.
Yeah, history is rarely neat and tidy. I think it's a good reminder that even economic powerhouses are built on, foundations that are complex and sometimes messy. But it's really that foundation that lets us understand the German economic model. So I've always heard about these things like finance capitalism and the middle stand. What makes those elements of the German system so unique?
Yeah, well, those are really two of the pillars of the German model. So let's start with finance capitalism. It's this system where banks and businesses form, close long-term relationships. So imagine instead of just looking at, quarterly profits, these banks are invested in the long-term success of their business partners. They offer guidance, they participate on company boards, and they really prioritize sustainable growth over just short-term gains.
And that's pretty different from like the Anglo-American model, which is a lot more transactional, right?
Right. Exactly. It's a much more, hands-on and long-term approach.
I'm kind of curious how that plays out practically. Can you give me an example?
Yeah. So take the middle stand. That's, the network of all these small and medium-sized businesses. They're, really the backbone of the German economy. And they have a really unique relationship with these things called public savings banks. So these banks were originally created to, promote savings among the middle class and workers, and they're very deeply embedded in their communities. And they play a crucial role in financing the middle stand, They make sure that those businesses have access to, capital to grow and to innovate.
So it's like a very symbiotic relationship.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that part of the reason why, Germany has such a strong manufacturing base, even, in the face of globalization?
Absolutely, yeah. Those close ties between banks and businesses and regional economies, it creates this sense of shared purpose and long-term commitment that you just don't really see in a lot of other places. But it's not just about finance. The German model also really emphasizes worker participation, which is something that's really rare in other industrialized nations.
So you're talking about co-determination, right?
Right.
Where workers actually have representation on company boards.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, that's always seemed like a radical concept to me.
Yeah, it is. It is pretty unique.
So you have workers actually having a real voice in major decisions,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, in, investment strategies, working conditions, all sorts of things.
I mean, I can see how that would lead to, more equitable outcomes and a greater sense of ownership.
Yeah.
But does it actually impact a company's bottom line?
That's a great question. And actually the evidence suggests that it can be beneficial for both, the workers and the company. Co-determination along with, these strong works councils that Germany has, they create this environment where labor and management work together to solve problems. They're not constantly butting heads, and so that can lead to greater productivity, lower turnover, and ultimately, a more competitive business.
So it's not just about keeping the workers happy.
Yeah.
It's really about, a more efficient and resilient system.
Right, exactly.
And it seems like that collaborative spirit really extends beyond just individual companies. Germany also has this very, very strong social safety net, right?
They do, yeah. It's universal health care, generous pensions, strong unemployment benefits. All these programs really create a sense of security for workers, and that translates into, greater social stability and higher productivity. If you think about it, if you're constantly worried about losing your job or not being able to afford health care, that's going to impact, your ability to focus on your work.
Yeah, for sure. So it's a system that's really designed to support both individuals and the economy as a whole.
Right.
And it's been remarkably successful for decades. But even the German miracle, as it was called, has faced its share of challenges, right?
Yep. Yeah, even the most well-oiled machines need, adjustments from time to time. And Germany's had to adapt to some really major shifts, starting with reunification.
Yeah.
Integrating East Germany's economy after the fall of the Berlin Wall, that was massive. I mean, it was a huge task. East Germany's, technology and infrastructure were way behind. And then the sudden conversion of, East German currency to the Deutschmark at this unrealistic rate. I mean, it created huge problems for East German businesses. And then you had this thing called the Treuhandanstalt, which was this agency tasked with privatizing all these East German state-owned enterprises. And they had to restructure thousands of companies in a very short period. And, that led to massive job losses and a lot of social unrest.
So reunification, I mean, as amazing and historic as it was, it really put a strain on the West German economy.
It did, yeah. And all of this was happening at the same time as globalization was, really taking off. And that brought its own set of challenges. German industries, especially things like manufacturing, they were facing intense competition from lower cost producers in other parts of the world.
So how did they adapt to that? I mean, did they just throw out their whole model?
No, they didn't, abandon it completely. But they did make some pretty big adjustments. Like in terms of labor relations, they introduced these things called opening clauses. And what those did was they gave companies more flexibility to negotiate, wages and working conditions directly with their workers. So they could kind of bypass those traditional industry-wide agreements.
So it was kind of injecting a little bit more flexibility into the system.
Right.
But I imagine that was probably pretty controversial.
Oh, yeah, it definitely was. I mean, some people argued that it, undermined the power of unions and eroded worker protections. Others said, hey, this is just a necessary adaptation to the realities of globalization. They said without it, German companies are going to lose their competitive edge. So it was a tough balancing act. And then there were the mini jobs.
The mini jobs. Remind me what those are again.
So basically they're like part-time jobs with, limited hours and earnings. And the idea was, they were supposed to provide some supplemental income or help people, transition back into the workforce. But they became super popular with employers because they were exempt from certain Social Security contributions.
Okay. So kind of a win for the employer, but maybe not so much security for the worker.
Right.
Were there any other big reforms that happened during this time?
Yeah. So they also did a bunch of corporate governance reforms. And the goal there was to try to, deepen their stock markets and attract more international investors. They even created a whole new technology stock exchange called a Neuermarkt. It was kind of their answer to the NASDAQ in the US. And what they were trying to do was, break up those old networks of bank ownership and foster this more dynamic entrepreneurial culture.
So really modernize the financial system.
Yeah.
Did it work?
Well, kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah.
The Neumarkt ended up failing to really live up to the hype. And the reforms did shift some ownership away from banks, but they didn't fundamentally change the way German companies operate. I mean, the emphasis on long-term relationships and stakeholder value, that stayed really strong.
So it's interesting that core of the German model, it remained even through all of these reforms.
It did, yeah.
But what about the social safety net? I mean, could they really sustain these really generous benefits in the face of, globalization and aging population?
Yeah, that was a huge challenge. I mean, with fewer workers supporting more retirees, the pressure on the welfare system was really mounting, and that's what led to these really controversial Hartz reforms under Chancellor Schröder.
The Hartz reforms, those were aimed at reducing unemployment and cutting welfare costs, right?
Yeah, exactly. So they reduced unemployment benefits. They made it harder to refuse job offers, and they introduced all these programs designed to, kind of activate the unemployed. And it was a pretty radical shift away from the, traditional German model. And it sparked this huge debate about, fairness and effectiveness.
I can imagine. Sounds like it must have been a really difficult time for a lot of people.
It was, but it's important to remember the context here, right?
Yeah.
Germany was facing some really serious economic challenges, and they had to figure out a way to make their welfare system sustainable for the long term.
So a lot of tough choices had to be made.
Yeah,
And on top of all that, Germany was also transitioning to the euro around this time,
that's
right?
right. Yeah.
What was the impact of that on their economy?
Well, the euro, that was a huge moment for Germany. And it had both positive and negative consequences. On the one hand, it made it much easier for German businesses to trade with other European countries, right? And that led to this big surge in exports. And it really helped solidify Germany's position as, the economic powerhouse of Europe. But it also created some new vulnerabilities.
Oh, how so?
Well, by adopting the euro, Germany basically tied its economic fate to the performance of other Eurozone countries. And this became really clear during the Eurozone crisis that started in 2009.
The Eurozone crisis. That was a defining moment for Europe, and it really put Germany in a tough spot. What exactly happened, and how did Germany respond? Well, it started with Greece, right? They were facing this sovereign debt crisis, and there were real fears that they might have to leave the euro, and that would have had this ripple effect throughout the whole Eurozone, including Germany.
Yeah.
And so initially there was a lot of resistance from Germany and some of the other Northern European countries to bailing out Greece.
Right.
They were worried about moral hazard, like if you bail out one country, then other countries are going to think hey, we can just be fiscally irresponsible and someone will come save us.
Yeah, it's a valid concern. But they did eventually step in and provide financial assistance. They did, yeah. And this is where Germany's, leadership role in Europe really came to the forefront. Chancellor Merkel, she worked really hard with other European leaders to put together these bailout packages for Greece and some of the other struggling economies. And they created all these new institutions and mechanisms to try to prevent future crises and strengthen the Eurozone.
So they kind of had to become the guarantor of the euro's stability.
Right, in a way.
But that didn't come without controversy.
No, definitely not. There were huge debates about, the conditions attached to the bailouts, especially those austerity measures that were imposed on countries like Greece. Some people said those measures were, way too harsh, and they actually made the situation worse by stifling economic growth. Other people, including, Germany, said that, look, this is necessary. We have to restore fiscal discipline. We have to prevent the whole Eurozone from collapsing.
So finding that solution that worked for everybody.
Yeah, it was a tough balancing act.
It was a real balancing act.
Yeah.
And then, of course, just a few years later, you have the global financial crisis in 2008. How did Germany fare during that?
They actually did surprisingly well, all things considered. They relied on this combination of short work programs, government stimulus, and this unique system they have of working time accounts. So basically what that means is companies can reduce employee hours instead of, laying people off during downturns. And the government makes up some of the lost wages.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and so this helped to, preserve jobs and skills, and it allowed them to bounce back pretty quickly once the crisis passed.
It seems like they were able to kind of draw on some of the the strengths of their model,
Yeah.
particularly that collaborative approach to labor relations.
Right.
But of course, they couldn't have anticipated the next big shock to the system, which was the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, no one could have predicted that, the scale of it, the impact. I mean, it was a global crisis unlike anything we'd seen in generations.
So how did Germany respond to that? Was it the same playbook?
Well, they did use a lot of the same tools, like expanding those short work programs, providing financial support to businesses, but they also had to adapt, to the unique challenges of the pandemic, things like lockdowns and supply chain disruptions, this sudden shift to remote work. And they also worked really closely with other European countries to coordinate their response, make sure that essential goods and services kept flowing across borders.
So a lot of improvisation.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. It sounds like, they navigated reunification, globalization, the Eurozone crisis, the global financial crisis, a global pandemic.
Yeah.
It's a pretty impressive track record. But I have a feeling the story doesn't end there.
It doesn't.
What are the new challenges, the new uncertainties that are facing the German export engine today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it kind of takes us to the heart of this moment that Germany's in right now, this Zeitenwende, this turning point. And to understand that, what we got to talk about, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that really shook, the foundations of Europe. And it forced Germany to confront some pretty uncomfortable truths.
All right, so let's talk about this Zeitenwende, this turning point you mentioned. What does Russia's invasion of Ukraine mean for Germany, especially when we talk about their economic future?
Well, I think one of the most immediate impacts was on energy. For decades, Germany has relied really heavily on Russia for natural gas.
It's cheap, right?
Exactly. It was cheap, it was readily available, and it fueled their industries and it heated their homes. But the invasion has really shown how risky that dependence was.
So now they're having to find alternatives.
Exactly. Yeah, they're looking to diversify their energy sources, importing more liquefied natural gas from other countries, accelerating the development of renewables, and they're even extending the life of some of their nuclear power plants, which, was a pretty controversial decision just a few years ago.
Yeah.
It's a huge task, and it's going to require a lot of investment and some pretty tough choices.
And this energy crisis, it must be having like ripple effects throughout the whole German economy.
Oh, absolutely. Energy prices have gone through the roof, and that's putting a real strain on businesses and households alike, There are concerns about inflation, a potential recession. And then the war has also disrupted global supply chains, so it's harder for German companies to get the materials and the components they need. It's a pretty uncertain time.
So how is Germany responding to all of this? I mean, are they just reacting, or are they thinking more strategically about the long term?
I think they're doing both. There's definitely this urgency to deal with the immediate crisis, but they're also trying to use this as an opportunity to kind of rethink their economic model and make it more resilient.
Can you give me an example of what that looks like?
Sure. One area they're really focusing on is strengthening their industrial base and becoming less dependent on foreign suppliers. They're talking about bringing back some of those manufacturing jobs that were outsourced, investing more in research and development, and really promoting innovation in key sectors like renewables and digital technology. There's this realization that they need to be more self-sufficient if they want to stay strong in a world that feels increasingly unpredictable.
It sounds like kind of a shift away from the globalization trends we've seen in recent decades.
It is, and it's not just Germany. We're seeing this in other countries too, like the U.S. There's this sense that maybe relying so heavily on global supply chains is a bit riskier than we thought, especially when those chains get disrupted by pandemics or wars.
So are we entering a new era of economic competition then?
It's possible, but I think it's more complicated than that. Yeah, there's definitely an element of competition, but there's also a growing awareness that we need to cooperate more on global challenges like climate change or cybersecurity. No country can solve those problems on their own.
Right. So where does all of this leave Germany? What's the future of their export engine?
I think they're at a crossroads.
Mm-hmm.
They have a lot of strengths to build on, a very skilled workforce, a strong tradition of innovation, and a pretty stable political system. But they've got some big challenges ahead, too. The energy crisis, the war in Ukraine, the rise of protectionism, and just the need to adapt to a world that's changing so quickly.
It's a pretty daunting task.
It is. But if any country can handle it, it's probably Germany. They have this history of overcoming adversity and coming out stronger, and they have a deep commitment to European unity and international cooperation.
Well, this has been a really fascinating look at the German export engine and how it's evolved over time. What would you say is the most important takeaway from all of this?
I think the key takeaway is that even the most successful economic models have to adapt and change.
Yeah.
Germany's success has been built on this really unique set of factors: historical circumstances, political choices, and just a culture that values hard work and innovation and social responsibility. But they've also shown that they're willing to learn from their mistakes, make those tough
Yeah.
decisions and embrace change when they have to. And that's a valuable lesson for any country.
I totally agree. I think what really struck me was just how collaborative the German economy is. Those partnerships between banks and businesses, the worker participation in decision making, the strong social safety net. I mean, these are all things that make them really resilient in the long run.
Absolutely. It's a system that's designed for shared prosperity,
Yeah.
and to withstand those economic shocks. It's not perfect, but it's definitely something other countries can learn from. And I think it'll be really interesting to see how they apply these principles to the challenges of the 21st century. The story of the German export engine is far from over.
We've given everyone a lot to think about. It's a complex topic and it's constantly changing, but hopefully this deep dive gave you some insights into the German experience and how it fits into the global economy. As always, thank you so much for joining us.